Clarence Boyd, a 76-year-old black Marine general who commanded thousands of troops in Afghanistan and won the Medal of Honor, but in the town of Ashford, he is seen as just another stranger. On what seemed like an ordinary morning, two white police officers tied him to a lamppost in front of a crowd in the downtown square and laughed at him in what they called a stranger lecture. Little did they know the man they humiliated had once saved the lives of an entire company. And the act set off a wave of outrage that swept across America. The town was forced to confront the truth. Sometimes the most shameful thing is not the mistake, but the silence that surrounds it. Because when Clarence stood up, the system bowed. Where are you hearing this story from? Leave your city in the comments. The morning briefing room at Ashford Police Department was unusually packed for a Tuesday. Chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as officers took their seats, mugs of coffee in hand, murmuring with the casual ease of routine. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the air thick with that sterile institutional smell of paperwork and indifference. But the moment the interim chief entered the room with two folded papers in hand, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The room quieted, as if instinctively bracing for a storm. Officers Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer, lounging in the back row like they owned the place, exchanged a glance. Jack wore that same smug grin he always did after a night of beers and bar stories. Kyle looked relaxed. Feet, stretched out arms, folded a half smirk forming as he whispered, "This better not be another memo about parking tickets." Neither of them had any reason to expect what came next. The interim chief didn't bother with a greeting. He walked straight to the front of the room, set the papers down, and looked directly at the two men in the back. "Officers Dalton and Mercer," he said, voice flat but firm. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay, pending a formal internal investigation into misconduct in public involving the humiliation of a civilian." The words hit like a gunshot in a library. Jack blinked. "Excuse me." Kyle leaned forward, frowning. "Wait, what, suspended for what?" The chief didn't repeat himself. Instead, he slid the documents across the table toward a senior officer to distribute, and continued. "You are to surrender your firearms badges and department-issued equipment before you leave this building today. You are not to contact any department personnel or interfere with the investigation in any way." Laughter and whispers rippled quietly among the younger officers. Others exchanged confused, wary glances. Jack's smirk evaporated, replaced by an open-mouthed glare. "This is about that old man in the square, isn't it?" he said. "That was nothing. Just a joke." The chief's jaw tightened. "That joke has triggered an avalanche that you have no idea how to stop. That man, as you called him, is not just a civilian. And even if he were, your actions would still be a violation of this department's code of conduct and of basic human decency." Kyle stood now, eyes wide, face red. "You're serious? We're getting suspended over some vagrant who probably wandered into town." Someone behind them coughed quietly. Another officer looked down, shaking his head. A female detective whispered to her partner, "This is going national, isn't it?" The partner didn't answer. Jack's voice was rising now. "We've handled worse. Come on. Half this department used to run those little welcoming lessons for outsiders. Why are we suddenly the example?" The chief didn't flinch. "Because this time someone filmed it, and because this time it wasn't just some outsider." His eyes locked on Jack. "You humiliated a decorated American veteran in front of a crowd, and the world is watching." Kyle turned to Jack, who looked like he'd been punched in the gut. A veteran, Kyle whispered. "That guy?" The chief raised a brow. "You didn't even check. You didn't ask. You didn't care. And now you'll face the consequences." The two officers stood frozen. The room watched them unravel in real time. One by one, colleagues who'd once laughed at their crude jokes began looking away. The brotherhood they'd counted on was already splintering, Kyle muttered under his breath, voice thick with disbelief. "All this, over some old man." The chief stared at him, unmoved. "No. Over a man you never should have laid hands on. Over a man you never took the time to see. Over a man who turned out to be everything you're not." Jack and Kyle were escorted from the room as silence fell again, this time heavier. No one said goodbye. In the hallway outside, Kyle hissed, "You think it's some kind of setup? This has to be political." Jack didn't answer. His mind was replaying that morning in the square, the way the man stood there, motionless. Quiet, dignified, even with a rope around his chest. He hadn't said a word. But something in his eyes, Something sharp and unmoving now clawed at Jack's memory. Back inside the conference room, the chief turned to the remaining officers. This department is under scrutiny. Our actions in the next few days will determine whether we remain a law enforcement agency or become an example of everything wrong with the system. No one spoke. Kyle's words still echoed faintly in the air, like the final note of a warning bell. All this for some old man. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the man they'd tried to break was one of the most respected war strategists in modern military history. A man with honors etched into the Pentagon itself. And what happened next would not just shake the department, but the entire country. To understand how two cops ended up in the crosshairs of a national scandal for humiliating a silent old man, we need to go back just 48 hours, when Clarence Boyd first stepped into Ashford. The morning sun hung low over Ashford's central square, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. It was the kind of crisp, quiet day when time seemed to move slowly, and nothing much happened until it did. A few townspeople were milling about, a barista setting out cafe chairs, a mother shepherding two kids into the bakery, a retired mechanic sipping coffee from a thermos on a park bench. No one expected a spectacle. No one expected shame. At first, the scene barely registered. Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer strolled into the square like they owned it, uniforms, sharp sunglasses in place, radiating the kind of confidence born not from authority, but from unchecked habits. Between them walked an elderly black man with a slight limp weathered clothes and a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. Clarence Boyd said nothing. He kept his head high but steady, his steps deliberate. They stopped at the center of the square. There, beside the old iron lamppost that had stood since the Civil War, the officers began their performance. Jack turned to the small but growing number of bystanders. "Folks, looks like we've got a visitor who's a little lost," he said loud enough to carry. "Doesn't know the rules around here." Kyle chuckled, pulling a length of rope from the patrol car. "Time for a quick history lesson." A few townspeople paused, glancing over from sidewalks and shop fronts. Some laughed uneasily. Others froze. One teenage girl pulled out her phone, hitting record without saying a word. An elderly couple across the street stopped in their tracks, the woman gripping her husband's arm. Jack grabbed Clarence by the shoulders and spun him toward the post. Kyle looped the rope loosely around his torso, tying it to the iron bars with exaggerated flourish. "There," Jack said. "Now you won't forget where you are." He smirked, brushing off his hands, as if the act had solved a problem. Clarence remained silent. He didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. That was the moment everything shifted. The joke wasn't funny anymore, not to the barista who stopped pouring coffee midstream, not to the old mechanic who now stood up slowly, his expression unreadable, not to the group of teenagers watching from the skate park cameras now aimed and recording. Jack leaned in close, lowering his voice so only Clarence could hear. "What, nothing to say? You just gonna stand there like a statue?" Clarence didn't blink. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of fear. It wasn't even resignation. It was something else, something that made Kyle take a small step back without realizing it. Jack forced a laugh and turned back to the gathering crowd. "Just making sure our guests learn the local customs. Can't have folks wandering in thinking this place is theirs to do what they want." Someone from the crowd called out, "Is this even legal?" Jack ignored it. Kyle crossed his arms, his smile more rigid now. Clarence, meanwhile, stood tall, the rope across his chest, hanging loose like it had been placed on a statue instead of a man. That was what disturbed them. He wasn't humiliated. He wasn't broken. He simply stood. A local teenager live-streaming the entire thing whispered into her phone, "He's not even moving." Why isn't he moving? Because Clarence Boyd knew something the rest of them didn't. Within minutes, the videos hit group chats, community Facebook pages, and private text threads. No one said much, but the shares kept going. A woman visiting from Charleston posted a 17-second clip with the caption, "Ashford PD just tied an old black man to a lamppost." Tell me this isn't real. The moment had ended, but the damage was done. Jack and Kyle eventually untied him, muttering something about lesson learned, and watch where you walk next time. Clarence walked away without a word. He didn't glance back. The crowd began to disperse, confused, unsettled, and silent. Some looked down at their shoes. Others kept filming as Clarence vanished around the corner, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. But no one forgot the way he had stood there. The image of Clarence Boyd at that lamppost would become the symbol of something much larger than Jack and Kyle ever imagined. because the man they thought was just another nameless drifter was anything but. And he hadn't needed to speak to leave his mark. Why would an elderly man publicly humiliated respond with neither fear nor protest? What did he know that silenced two men armed with power and arrogance? The answer wasn't just coming, it was already spreading faster than either of them could control. And the videos, raw and unfiltered, were now crossing county lines, screens, and state borders far beyond anything the town of Ashford could contain. The video didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within hours of being posted, it had been shared across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and even Reddit, with clips edited, zoomed, and captioned. Onlookers online weren't silent. They had questions, and they had fury. Most of all, they had a growing suspicion that the elderly black man tied to the lamppost in Ashford wasn't just a nameless victim. Something about the way he stood, the restraint in his posture, the calm in his face, it didn't align with helplessness. It looked practiced. It looked trained. Why does he stand like that, one user tweeted. That's not fear. That's discipline. A Facebook commenter wrote, "My uncle was a Marine. He said no ordinary man holds composure like that. That's a soldier's stance." And then came the hashtag, "Shock Justice for the Elderly Vet." It started as a whisper. Then it trended. Some thought it was satire. Others dug deeper. A few internet sleuths began reverse image searches trying to match his face with any known photo from military archives. But his image yielded nothing. No name, no connection, no past. At Channel 9 News investigative reporter Lisa Jennings was already halfway through her lunch when she got the first ping, then the second, then a barrage of notifications from both anonymous tips and newsroom colleagues. A man humiliated by police in Ashford, South Carolina. No charges, no resistance, and a silence that unsettled everyone. Lisa dropped her sandwich and pulled up the video. She watched once, then again. Then she hit pause. She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. It wasn't the cruelty that caught her attention. She'd seen worse. It was the man, his eyes. There was nothing random about him. Lisa Jennings had built her career on reading what others missed. And in that still frame, an elderly man bound by rope but staring ahead with calm defiance, she didn't see a victim. She saw a question that hadn't been answered. Yet, within 20 minutes, she had sent emails to the Department of Defense database liaison, an old contact at the Veterans Administration, and a few trusted archivists. Then she started calling local shelters, VA hospitals, and homeless outreach centers. No one had seen him. No one knew his name. But several had heard the same thing. An older black man, polite, quiet, always declined to share too much and preferred to stay alone. In a cheap room at a roadside motel just outside Ashford, Clarence Boyd sat in a chair by the window, the curtains drawn halfway. His phone was silent. His TV was off. But his laptop was open and he was watching. Every post, every share, every theory. He didn't react. He never did. But his finger hovered briefly over the trackpad as a comment floated across the screen. "If he's who I think he is, Ashford just made the biggest mistake of its life." He closed the laptop. Back at Channel 9, Lisa finally got a hit, not through official channels, but via a military chat room. A retired Navy commander mentioned a name from decades past. "Could be Boyd," the comment said. "Clarence Boyd. Used to be big in strategic operations. Heard he vanished years ago after his wife died. No press, no farewell, just disappeared." Lisa's heart skipped. She ran the name through her internal search engine, cross-referenced with classified mentions, military honors, strategic deployments. The matches were limited, the files were redacted, and that only made her more certain. Whoever Clarence Boyd was, he had been important. And someone, maybe Boyd himself, had worked very hard to keep his records buried deep. But why Lisa sat back in her chair staring at the screen, already knowing the answer before she said it aloud. Because he didn't want to be found. The question now wasn't just who he was, but why a man with that background would choose to live like a ghost, and more importantly, what kind of world allows a decorated veteran to be roped to a lamppost without a second glance. The newsroom around her buzzed with other stories, weather updates, sports highlights, election coverage. But Lisa was locked in. Every second more details slipped through the cracks. Anonymous sources, grainy photos, partial service medals identified from still frames. The story was writing itself faster than she could type. She picked up her phone and dialed her editor. "I think we've got something massive," she said. "Not just about Ashford, bigger, about who we forget. And what that says about us." On the motel floor, Clarence had begun to pack. Outside, the world was finally beginning to remember what he had tried so long to forget. And as the search intensified, one thing became clear. This man didn't just disappear. He erased himself on purpose. Now that silence was unraveling, and the truth Clarence Boyd had spent years burying was about to surface, whether he liked it or not. The silence didn't unravel in one dramatic moment. It cracked slowly, like pressure building under decades of restraint. And Clarence Boyd alone, in a sparsely furnished room at the edge of town, felt every inch of it give way. The man who had vanished willingly was about to be dragged back into the light, and he knew it. He stood by the desk, motionless eyes locked on the old military-issued box he hadn't touched in over a decade. There was nothing ceremonial about what he was about to do. No music, no flags, just a box, a past, and a decision. Clarence reached down, popped the latches, and opened it. Inside was everything he'd hidden. The folder sat on top. Manila. Thick, faintly yellowed at the corners. He opened it, slowly revealing documents no civilian had ever seen. Major General Clarence L. Boyd, retired, United States Marine Corps. Attached were copies of classified deployment orders, commendation letters, citations, a detailed map of an operation in Kandahar, handwritten mission notes, and near the back, a formal certificate of honor bearing the presidential seal and a name nearly forgotten. He didn't linger. Beneath the paperwork was the uniform. The wool was still stiff. The insignia, 2 silver stars on each shoulder untarnished. Folded over the inside lining was a small velvet case. He opened it without a second thought. The Medal of Honor rested inside, still untouched. He'd never worn it, never displayed it. The award ceremony had been done privately, without press at his request. It wasn't humility, it was mourning. He didn't feel pride looking at it now. He felt distance. Clarence pulled out a photograph tucked under the medal case. A younger version of himself, eyes sharper, jaw clenched, stood with his unit in the Afghan desert. Dust in the air. Shadows stretched long from burning vehicles behind them. To his right stood a captain named Keating. The two had saved an entire medical convoy from being wiped out, but Keating hadn't made it back. Clarence had written the letter to Keating's family himself. He'd rewritten it 4 times, and none of the versions had felt good enough. He sat down, not because he was tired, but because memory had weight. He remembered the decisions that got him promoted, those hard calls that led to lives saved and others lost. The night missions. The pinned-down radio calls. The exact moment when he realized he didn't just command men, he carried their ghosts. And then the moment he left it all. Not on bad terms, not in disgrace, but after his wife passed, the world behind the uniform no longer made sense. She'd held him together for so long, through deployments, through public honors, through the silence that followed. When she died, the noise returned. So he left. Quietly, deliberately. He donated what money he had to her favorite education fund, and faded from the world that once saluted him. Disappearing wasn't cowardice. It was clarity. He didn't need the applause. He needed stillness. Until now. He looked at his hands. Older, scarred, steady. The same hands that had once drawn evacuation routes, signed orders, held dying men, and buried the woman he loved. They weren't trembling. He stood again, unfolded the uniform, and placed it beside the files. From a drawer he retrieved a secondary ID, a worn plastic card that still bore his name and rank. It was expired, but it was real. Next came his discharge papers, his credentials, and a folded letter from his former commanding officer. That letter had stayed sealed for years until now. He unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded slightly. "Your silence is your right, Clarence. But if the world forgets what dignity looks like, maybe one day, you'll have to remind them." He folded it again, tucked it in the bag. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about clearing his name because no one even knew it yet. It was about correcting a picture that had gone unchallenged. 2 men thought they'd bound an invisible man to a lamppost and walked away victorious. They hadn't tied up a nobody. They'd exposed themselves. He zipped the bag shut. He didn't need headlines. He didn't need pity. But he needed to be seen. Once, Because if no one stood up and reminded this town and this country what integrity looked like when everything else was stripped away, then all of it meant nothing. He put on the coat, grabbed the bag, opened the door. He would not confront them with rage. He would confront them with everything they never expected: restraint, record, and truth. And his first move would be so simple, it would knock the breath out of the entire department. The day before the suspension, the department had still been running on autopilot. No public backlash, no headlines, no outside scrutiny. Just another late afternoon inside Ashford PD's officer lounge, where the smell of reheated coffee mixed with the low buzz of casual bravado. Officer Evan Collins sat in the corner, eyes on his tablet, tuning out the nonsense as best he could. He was new to matter. The kind of rookie they overlooked but never really trusted. Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer burst through the door mid-laugh, loud and careless. Jack grabbed a soda from the fridge while Kyle kicked back on the couch like it was his living room. They didn't even glance at Evan. That was their mistake. "Did you see that guy's face?" Jack said, cracking open his can, like he'd never been outside before. Just stood there, roped up and frozen. Kyle grinned. "We should have taken a photo. Call it Ashford Welcome Wagon." Evan blinked, heart slowing. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his pulse began to rise. He recognized the tone, the smirk, the casual cruelty. It wasn't the first time he'd heard stories from these two, but this time, it wasn't a story. "I bet that old man's still wandering around wondering what the hell happened," Jack added. "We should make it a tradition." That was the moment Evan realized what they had done was real. Not just real, but wrong. And they thought no one cared. He reached into his bag slowly, careful not to draw attention, and wrapped his fingers around his phone. It was his personal device, disconnected from the department's network. Still recording, still safe. He angled it just enough, hit the button, and let the audio roll. 2 minutes. Clear voices. 2 names. One story too vile to ignore. When Jack got up to adjust the TV, Evan ended the recording. He slipped the phone into his pocket, stood up calmly, and left the room without a word. He didn't breathe easy until the door shut behind him. In the locker room, he replayed the recording in his headphones. Every word confirmed it. They had tied an elderly man to a lamppost, mocked him in public, and felt no remorse. No policy protected that. No badge could justify it. He debated for half an hour. Could he go to his sergeant to internal affairs? Would anyone believe him, or worse, label him a traitor? But Evan wasn't looking for applause. He just couldn't live with silence. He created a new email account, attached the recording, and typed out a single sentence. "You need to hear what they said." He didn't sign it. He didn't timestamp it. He hit send to the only person he thought might actually care, Lisa Jennings, the investigative reporter, now circling the story like a hawk. Then he put his phone face down and went home, unsure if he'd made the biggest mistake of his career or the most important decision of his life. That night, he barely slept. His conscience didn't let him. But the next morning, when the entire department was called into an emergency briefing, and the interim chief read out the official suspension orders for Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer, Evan knew. The video had landed, and the truth had already started to move. No one connected it to him. He said nothing. He sat in the corner like he always did. But something had shifted. Because sometimes the first crack in a corrupt foundation doesn't come from outside. It comes from the inside, when one person refuses to keep playing along. And the clip Evan sent, clumsy, raw, and undeniable, was about to hit the airwaves. Within hours, Lisa Jennings would make sure the entire town of Ashford heard the truth, and the country with it. Hours after the department quietly suspended the 2 officers involved, Ashford still had no answers. No official press release, no apology, just a closed-door decision and a town full of questions. But Lisa Jennings had no intention of letting it end there. A decorated war hero had been humiliated in public, and the community deserved to know exactly what had happened and who had paid the price for staying silent. She wasn't just going to report the truth. She was going to make sure it echoed. By mid-morning, Lisa stood in the center of Ashford's town square, a place now infamous across social media. She held a microphone in one hand, phone in the other, checking signal strength. Her cameraman gave her a quick nod. Locals milled about, pretending not to watch, but everyone was watching. A few recognized her. Others didn't know her name, but they'd seen her face in their feeds all week. The square still looked ordinary. The old lamppost was there exactly where Clarence Boyd had been tied 2 days before, a reminder quiet and unmoved. Lisa took her place in front of it. No teleprompter, no cue cards, just her voice and the weight of what she was about to say. "We're live in Ashford, South Carolina." She began, her voice steady but sharp. "Where earlier this week 2 police officers tied an elderly man to this very post in what they called a lesson for outsiders. What they didn't realize, and what many of you have been asking, is who that man was." The live stream comments surged. Thousands watching, dozens joining every second. Lisa continued. "Thanks to a brave source within the department, we now have audio footage of the officers Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer discussing the incident in detail. They admitted to the act. They laughed about it. They called it tradition." She paused. The square was silent now. Phones were out, eyes locked on her. "What they didn't know, and what you're about to learn, is who they tied to that post." She held up a printed photo. Not from the video. Not from any public file. A younger Clarence Boyd in uniform standing with his unit overseas, 2 stars on his collar. Behind him, a tattered U.S. flag fluttered in the desert wind. "That man," Lisa said, her voice firm, "is Major General Clarence L. Boyd, retired United States Marine Corps. A man who commanded troops in Afghanistan. A man awarded the Medal of Honor. A man whose leadership saved countless American lives, both overseas and here at home. A man who chose to live quietly after a lifetime of service. Until now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People turned to each other, whispering, shocked. A woman gasped audibly. A man near the courthouse lowered his head, jaw clenched. "Anger wasn't just building, it was boiling," Lisa went on. "They didn't just humiliate a stranger, they humiliated a man who had once protected the very freedoms they swore to uphold. They mocked someone who had bled for this country while wearing the same uniform they now disgrace." Her words cut deeper than any headline could. And then she added calmly, "They thought they were tying up a nobody, but they tied up one of our nation's heroes, and now the world knows." Behind the crowd, Clarence Boyd stood silently in a dark blazer. No medals, no pomp, just presence. He didn't step forward. Not yet. But the shift in the air was palpable. People were turning, faces changed, murmurs became outrage. And in that moment, Ashford changed too, not with sirens or protests, but with realization. Lisa lowered her mic. "This isn't just about Ashford," she said. "This is about how quickly we forget the people who've served, and what it means when justice is treated like a joke." Then she stepped back, ending the broadcast. The live stream ended, but the silence in the square lingered. No one spoke. The truth didn't need an echo. It had landed. Clarence remained still behind the crowd, watching. He hadn't asked for vindication. He hadn't come to be revealed. But now that the truth was out, he understood what had to come next. Because now that Ashford knew who he was, it was time for him to show them who he still is. The crowd hadn't even fully dispersed from the town square when Clarence Boyd began preparing for what had to come next. His public exposure wasn't a climax. It was a doorway. The truth was out, but truth alone didn't restore dignity. And he wasn't done yet. That morning, as Ashford stirred under the weight of revelation, Clarence stood before a mirror in a quiet room. He adjusted the collar of his dress uniform with the kind of precision you don't forget, no matter how many years pass. The fabric was heavy with history. His history. Polished shoes. Medals aligned perfectly over his chest. 2 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder. He didn't practice a speech. He didn't need one. He walked out into the crisp morning air and made his way to the Ashford Police Department, not as a victim, not even as a witness, but as a man reclaiming control of the narrative. And when he pushed through the double-glass doors, every conversation inside the station died instantly. It wasn't the uniform. It was the presence. The interim chief had called for a full staff briefing at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Every available officer was gathered in the main hall, those not suspended, not reassigned, not already under scrutiny. Word had spread fast. The live stream had made its rounds. Still, no one expected this. Clarence entered without fanfare, without introduction. Just the sound of his shoes on polished tile. All eyes turned. The room that had once laughed at an old man now stood completely still. He stepped to the front directly across from the long row of seated officers. Some sat stiffly, others shifted awkwardly. One young officer stood up out of reflex. Another lowered his gaze, unable to meet Clarence's eyes. He didn't rush. Clarence scanned the room, his face calm, his eyes sharp. The interim chief stepped aside, giving him the floor. He didn't need to be introduced. Everyone knew exactly who he was. Finally, Clarence spoke, his voice, clear, deliberate, carrying the authority of a battlefield and the weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. Years ago, I stood in front of young Marines before a mission that none of us were certain we'd return from. I looked them in the eyes and I asked them to be better than the enemy, not stronger, not more ruthless, better. Because if we ever lost that, then no medal, no flag, no uniform would mean a damn thing. He paused. The silence thickened. But this week in this building, 2 officers disgraced the very idea of what that badge is supposed to represent. And worse, no one in this room stopped them. A few officers shifted in their seats. No one spoke. "I've faced men with rifles pointed at me," he said quietly. "And I've never seen cowardice like I've seen here." There it was. The words didn't need volume. They cut clean and deep. Clarence looked around. "Some of you probably think what happened to me was a mistake, or that it wasn't your business, that someone else should have stepped in. Let me be clear, every time someone says nothing, they give permission. Every time someone stays silent, they write the next chapter of abuse." He turned his gaze toward the 2 empty chairs, reserved in the corner, the ones where Jack and Kyle should have sat if they hadn't been suspended the day before. Those 2 may have started this, but it only went as far as the rest of you allowed it to. He let the weight of that truth settle. Clarence stepped forward one more pace. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came because silence is how rot spreads. And if no one stands up and says, 'This is where it ends,' then it never ends." Hook delivered not as a punchline, but a reckoning. The interim chief gave a slight nod. Clarence folded his hands behind his back and added more quietly, "Your badge is a contract with the people, and if you're not ready to honor it, you need to hand it in before someone else pays the price for your weakness." He stepped away from the center, offering no goodbye, no flourish. He simply walked toward the exit. No one moved. As he reached the door, he paused briefly and said one final line, low but unmistakable. "You'll either fix this department yourselves, or I promise you the people out there will do it for you." And with that, he left them staring at the door at each other and at the uniforms they thought they understood. Jack and Kyle, watching from the hallway, where they had been told to wait for a disciplinary hearing, had seen and heard every word through the open doorway. And in that moment, the men who once laughed at an old stranger sat silently, heads bowed. Because this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The silence Clarence left behind didn't fade. It deepened. Less than an hour later, every officer in the Ashford Police Department was called back into the large conference hall for a mandatory briefing. No one knew the exact reason. No one asked. But after the live stream, after Clarence's walk through the building in full uniform, no one dared pretend everything was fine. At the front of the room, the projector screen had been lowered. A laptop sat connected waiting. The interim chief stood off to the side, not in command now, but clearly in wait. Clarence was already seated near the front, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to keep the room in check. And then the door opened, and in stepped a man no one recognized, tall-suited, crisp in his movements. He moved like someone who wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to listen, evaluate, and decide. The brass badge clipped to his belt and the small DOJ seal on his lapel said the rest. "Special Investigator Raymond Cole, U.S. Department of Justice," he said calmly but loud enough for the back row to hear. "As of this morning, I've been assigned to review potential civil rights violations inside this department." The tension snapped. A ripple moved across the room like a pressure wave. No one spoke. Jack Dalton, seated near the far wall next to Kyle Mercer, leaned slightly forward in his chair, his mouth drawing into a tighter line. Kyle sat back, arms crossed, jaw clenched, but eyes unsteady. Investigator Cole turned slightly. "Major General Boyd, if you're ready." Clarence stood without a word and walked to the laptop. He tapped the touchpad, and the screen behind him lit up. The opening frame of Lisa Jennings's live stream, the lamppost, the crowd, and him tied there motionless, surrounded by laughter and cameras. He hit play. No one in the room blinked. They watched it all. Jack and Kyle's voices, the town's reaction, Lisa's words, the revelation. Clarence didn't turn to gauge their reactions. He simply let the room feel what it needed to feel. Let the footage expose everything better than any speech could. When it ended, he stepped aside. Jack cleared his throat. "Look, it was never meant to go that far. Around here we have traditions. You know, ways to remind outsiders that this isn't just any town." He forced a half shrug. "It's not personal. It's just how things are done." Clarence said nothing, but the federal investigator didn't. "Traditions," Cole repeated, stepping forward. "You're telling me tying an elderly man to a public post, mocking him, filming him, was some kind of civic ritual?" Jack opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Cole didn't wait. "What tradition teaches you to publicly humiliate a Medal of Honor recipient?" The line hit like a blow. The room was still. Several officers looked away. Others stiffened. Kyle remained frozen. "Let me make this very clear." Cole continued, his voice cold now. "The Department of Justice is opening a formal investigation. Based on the video, the statements provided by media and internal sources, and what I've just witnessed in this room, there is probable cause for charges of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and public misconduct." Jack tried to speak again, but this time it was Kyle who cut in low, almost muttering. "We didn't know who he was." Clarence's voice cut through the room, calm but razor sharp. "You didn't need to." Cole turned to Clarence with a nod of agreement, then addressed the room. "From this point forward, all officers are to cooperate fully with the investigation. Department files, communications, and prior complaints are being reviewed. If you think you can hide behind tradition, think again. What happened here isn't a culture, it's a cover." Jack shifted again, but no one looked at him. No one nodded. No one came to his defense. Clarence finally turned to face him, his voice measured. "What you call tradition, I call a failure of training, of leadership, of conscience. And you're not the only ones responsible, but you were the first ones to get caught. The interim chief tried to restore order. Until the investigation concludes, both officers will remain suspended." Cole cut in. "With immediate restrictions on access to department facilities, vehicles, and communications. They're not suspended anymore. They're under federal review." Jack's face paled. Kyle lowered his head. Clarence gave one final look across the room, not to gloat, not for satisfaction, but to remind them all what silence breeds. And outside the glass windows, the town of Ashford began to gather again. Reporters, citizens, veterans. Justice wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a voice, and a uniform they couldn't ignore, because consequences, when they finally arrive, tend to come faster than anyone expects. And this time, they had. The news had already gone national, but in Ashford, the real reckoning wasn't happening on camera. It was happening in the community center, 2 blocks from the square, inside a worn-out hall with folding chairs, chipped walls, and a hand-painted sign above the entrance that read, "Ashford Listens." That night the room was packed. Not with reporters, not with outsiders, but with people who had lived here their whole lives. People who had nodded politely, stayed quiet, looked the other way. But now, after Clarence Boyd's revelation, after the video, after the federal investigation began, something had broken loose. Not just rage, something older, something deeper. Grief. Lisa Jennings sat near the front notebook in hand, but tonight, she wasn't here to report. She was here to witness. Clarence stood against the back wall in civilian clothes, now his uniform left in the motel room, replaced by something more permanent presence. The mayor had opened the meeting with brief remarks, but she knew better than to talk too long. The room didn't want speeches. It wanted release. A woman in her 60s stepped up first. She held a small photo in her hands and spoke in a voice that quivered but didn't break. 3 years ago, Jack Dalton pulled my grandson from his car during a stop. Said he looked suspicious. He was 15, wearing a hoodie. I didn't file a complaint because I thought it wouldn't matter. But it did. It mattered to my grandson. A pause. He doesn't drive anymore. The microphone passed to a man in work boots. He spoke quietly, eyes down. Kyle Mercer threatened to tow my truck and arrest me over a cracked taillight. He told me to remember who runs this town. I didn't speak up then. I was afraid of what would happen to my business. But I'm done being afraid. One by one the voices rose. Not angry, not screaming, but breaking open with pain that had festered too long in silence. Then from the third row, a frail hand went up. A volunteer brought the mic. The room quieted before the old woman even stood. She was in her late 80s, wore a faded shawl. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the microphone. Her eyes found Clarence in the back. When my husband came back from Korea, she said softly, he never talked about what he saw. But he always said one thing. The only thing worse than war is coming home and being forgotten. Her voice cracked. Years ago, Jack Dalton cornered me in the parking lot behind the library, accused me of trespassing on town property. I didn't say anything. I let it go. Told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. But after seeing what they did to that man... She looked at Clarence now, her lips trembling. To you, I realize silence is a kind of permission. She wiped her eyes with a wrinkled hand. I can't stay silent anymore. The room was still. Clarence didn't move, didn't nod, didn't bow, but he held her gaze, and in that moment the connection between them was louder than any speech. Lisa looked around the room and knew this wasn't just a community meeting. It was a reckoning. Another man stood, a former postal worker. He didn't speak into the mic at first. He just held up a citation issued by Kyle Mercer from 2 years ago, signed, dated, and unjustified. I kept this, he said, because I knew one day someone would ask why I never trusted the badge again. Then the floodgates opened. One by one hands went up. Stories came out. Of intimidation, of humiliation, of quiet fear, and for the first time of honesty. Clarence walked forward not to speak but to listen up close. His presence wasn't a symbol anymore. It was a mirror. Every story that came out in some way reflected his own. The truth had been buried for years, but now it rose tangled in memories, sharpened by regret, strengthened by unity. No one shouted. No one protested. But the weight of the testimonies was deafening. What happened to Clarence had sparked outrage, but what happened to everyone else had built the fire beneath it. Lisa leaned forward, jotting notes not for a story, but for history. Because what she was seeing was more than collective trauma. It was collective awakening. Near the end of the night, a young woman stood and asked, "What happens now?" No one answered right away, until the mayor spoke again this time. No notes, no podium. Just a voice cracking under pressure. "We send every word tonight to the Attorney General's office," she said. "We push for public hearings, for formal charges, for change in leadership if that's what it takes." And then she looked at Clarence. "We owe you more than an apology." He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because by now it was clear to everyone in the room this wasn't just about him. It was about them, about the rot that had gone unnoticed, and the roots that had been exposed, and the tide that could no longer be held back. The pressure outside was building. Online, the clips had gone viral again, but this time the national conversation wasn't about a shocking video. It was about accountability memory and the cost of silence. The town of Ashford had finally found its voice, and the courts both of law and of public opinion were about to be forced to listen. The courtroom of Ashford County had seen its share of small-town disputes, property cases, misdemeanors, the occasional bar fight that got out of hand. But today, every pew was filled, every hallway buzzed with tension, and every eye was fixed on the front bench. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning broadcast live across the state and felt in the silence of every local home. At the prosecution's table sat Rosa Clark, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was in her late 30s, soft-spoken and not used to attention. Her lawyer whispered encouragement, but she barely nodded. Across the aisle, Jack Dalton sat, stiff jaw clenched his lawyer, adjusting a tie that didn't make him look any more prepared than he felt. Clarence Boyd sat behind Rosa, not as a witness yet, but as a presence, calm, upright, unblinking. His medals were not pinned to his chest today. He didn't need them. The judge entered and called the courtroom to order. The state began with a timeline. Then documentation. Then came Rosa. She stepped forward slowly. When she took the stand, her voice trembled at first but steadied as she spoke, not because she found courage, but because she couldn't afford not to. 2 years ago she began, my son and I were coming home from a school event. It was late. He was still wearing his band uniform. We stopped at a gas station. She paused, looking down. Officer Dalton pulled in behind us. He asked me what I was doing while I was parked there. I told him I was just grabbing water for my son. He said I looked out of place. Her knuckles whitened. He told me I needed to respect the image of this town, that I was the type of woman who teaches her kid to beg. My son, he was 11. He heard every word. I'll never forget the look on his face. Gasps echoed quietly across the room. Jack stared ahead, unmoving. I didn't file a report, Rosa said. I didn't think it would matter. But since that night, my son won't speak to anyone in uniform. Not even crossing guards. That's what he remembers, humiliation, not safety. She gripped the edge of the stand. I came here today because someone finally stood up and made the silence break. I'm here because of him. She turned slightly toward Clarence. The room stilled. Her voice cracked. We shouldn't need a general to be tied to a pole before people believe us. No one said a word. The judge gave her a long, solemn nod and thanked her. She stepped down, wiping her eyes. The prosecution called Clarence next. As he rose, the atmosphere shifted. Even Jack seemed to shrink in his seat. Clarence took the oath, then sat with the quiet dignity of a man who had buried comrades, survived battles, and carried more weight than any courtroom had the space to hold. When I was stationed in Kandahar, he began, we dealt with two kinds of threats, those that came with bullets and those that came with silence. He folded his hands. I learned that silence kills. It kills morale, it kills trust, and eventually it kills people. Not always with weapons. Sometimes it kills them with shame, with humiliation, with the kind of pain you can't treat with a medic. His gaze settled on the jury, then on Jack. When you humiliate a person, especially in front of their child, you don't just strip their dignity. You teach that child that dignity is fragile, that it can be taken, that it isn't safe. Clarence's voice didn't rise. It lowered, like gravity pulling everyone in. That kind of policing isn't just wrong, it's betrayal, not just of the badge, but of every person who ever trusted it. He looked to the judge. Rosa Clark shouldn't have had to sit in this chair, and I shouldn't have either. But we did, because the silence lasted too long. He nodded once, then added quietly, I've buried Marines who died protecting this country, but the kind of wounds created here. They don't get military funerals. They just stay open. There were no dry eyes. Even the judge paused before continuing. No one dared fill the silence that followed Clarence's words. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just breath and gravity. The defense tried to recover, talked about department pressure, miscommunication, unfortunate tone. It didn't land. No one believed it. Not anymore. The verdict was unanimous. The judge's voice echoed clearly. This court finds Officer Jack Dalton guilty of abuse of authority and public misconduct. Sentencing will be determined following further review, but let the record show this court does not tolerate the degradation of its citizens, especially by those entrusted to protect them. Jack didn't look up. And yet, as important as the verdict was, everyone in the room knew something bigger was happening outside these walls. Because after the doors opened, after the cameras caught Clarence walking down the courthouse steps beside Rosa Clark, the conversation didn't stop. It deepened. And the question wasn't just about justice for one town anymore. It was about the system that allowed it, and whether this verdict would be the end of the beginning, or the beginning of the end. Kyle Mercer, unlike Jack, had chosen a quieter path. Just days before the trial began, he accepted a plea agreement admitting guilt on multiple counts in exchange for a reduced sentence and full cooperation with the federal investigation. No courtroom drama, no public apology, just a signature on a document and a quiet exit through the side door of justice. But to the people of Ashford, his silence said everything. He hadn't fought the charges because he couldn't, and though his sentence would be lighter, the stain of what he did would remain just as dark. No one cheered. No one clapped. But as word of his plea deal spread through the community, there was a collective sense of closure. One man had faced the jury. The other had confessed. The weight of justice doesn't always fall with sirens and shouting. Sometimes it lands with the click of a badge hitting the floor. At Ashford Police Department, the briefing room felt colder than usual, though no one had touched the thermostat. It wasn't the air that chilled them. It was what they knew was coming. The entire department had been called in uniforms, pressed postures, rigid eyes, wary. No one made small talk. Even the usual sounds, chairs, scraping doors, swinging boots tapping, seemed to vanish under the thick hush that filled the room. Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer stood at the front side by side but miles apart in demeanor. Kyle's face was drawn, pale lips pressed tight, as if holding in breath or regret. Jack, by contrast, wore the mask of defiance. Chin slightly raised, jaw locked, as if daring anyone to say he'd lost. But his hands were trembling, barely visible, unless you knew where to look. Clarence Boyd stood off to the right, not in uniform, but still commanding every glance. Behind him, Special Investigator Raymond Cole from the Department of Justice prepared a folder in his hand. A legal formality. A document that would end one chapter but not the story. The interim chief called the room to attention. This department stands at a crossroads, he said, and it must choose accountability or collapse under denial. Today is not about spectacle, it's about responsibility. Cole stepped forward. His voice was calm, but carried weight that couldn't be dismissed. Per the findings of the DOJ's investigation, and in accordance with internal misconduct procedures and state law, former officers Jack Dalton and Kyle Mercer have been officially terminated from the Ashford Police Department. Furthermore, both individuals have been referred for criminal prosecution. He turned to them. Gentlemen, you are hereby required to surrender your weapons and badges, effective immediately. Kyle didn't hesitate. His fingers moved slowly but surely, unhooking his holster and unclipping his badge. He set both items on the table with trembling hands, his shoulders collapsing as he stepped back. No words, no excuses. Just silence. Jack stood still. The room held its breath. Mr. Dalton Cole said again, "Your badge." Jack finally moved. He reached up with practiced hands, removing the gold badge that had once meant power, once meant invincibility. He looked at it longer than expected. Then he placed it down, flat and final. But when he turned to unstrap his sidearm, his fingers fumbled. The tension in his arms betrayed him. His bravado slipped. Just for a second. Clarence saw it. Everyone did. Jack set the gun beside the badge, then stepped back, eyes forward, pretending he hadn't just lost everything. "You may think this is the end of something," Cole said, facing the room now. "But it's only the beginning of cleaning out what has been tolerated for far too long." No one applauded. No one needed to. The absence of protest was louder than celebration. Clarence looked across the room, not at Jack or Kyle, but at the other officers, those still wearing their badges. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. What happens next isn't up to them. It's up to the ones who are still here. Jack tried to maintain his posture as he and Kyle were escorted from the room, but the hallways of Ashford PD didn't belong to him anymore. The eyes that once averted now stared straight through him. He had worn the badge like armor, but now stripped of it, there was nothing left to shield the truth. And Kyle, he didn't even try. He just walked empty like a man who knew exactly what he deserved. Back in the room, no one sat down. The tension didn't lift, but something had shifted. They had seen the impossible happen. Not through riots, not through politics, through the quiet persistence of one man who refused to be erased. And no one in that building would ever again say, "It's just tradition," because tradition had just been let out the back door in handcuffs. Outside, Clarence didn't wait for reporters. He didn't give a statement. He walked alone toward the edge of the square, his steps slow-measured. Lisa Jennings watched from across the street, notebook closed, hands in her coat pockets. The man who had once sat invisible beneath a street lamp had just forced an entire system to its knees. But Clarence didn't stay to bask in what he had done. He was walking toward what he still had to do, because he hadn't come to take back honor. He'd come to build something better, and that work was just beginning. Ashford had never hosted a crowd like this, not for a parade, not for an election, and certainly not for a statue. But on this bright Saturday morning, the entire town gathered in the square, young and old, uniformed and plain-clothed long-time residents, and those who had once kept to the shadows. There were no banners, no political speeches, just one modest stage beneath the clear sky, and a large black cloth draped over a bronze figure at the center of the square, the same square where not long ago humiliation had stood in place of honor. Lisa Jennings stood near the front, notebook in hand, but she wasn't reporting. Not today. Today she was part of the story. Next to her was Evan Collins, the young officer whose quiet courage had cracked the silence. Further down the line, Emily, the waitress who had once warned a stranger in a diner to leave before it was too late, stood with a bouquet of white flowers. Her eyes didn't leave the statue. Not once. Clarence Boyd stood behind the podium, hands folded. No uniform, no medals, just the same steady calm that had changed a town. He looked out over the crowd and saw not eyes of pity or admiration, but eyes that had awakened. He cleared his throat, but the crowd had already fallen silent. "I'm not a hero," Clarence said. "I'm a reminder of what happens when good people stay quiet, and what's possible when just one person chooses not to." He looked toward Emily. A kind voice from a waitress, then to Evan. A quiet decision from a young officer. Then Lisa. A truth spoken loud enough that the world could hear it. He turned to the statue, still cloaked, and continued. "This isn't just a statue of me. It's a marker of a moment when this town changed." When silence ended. With that, the mayor stepped forward and pulled away the cloth. The bronze sculpture beneath was modest in size, but powerful in posture. Clarence not standing tall, but seated on a bench, hands resting on his knees, gaze forward, steady. He wasn't cast as a warrior. He was cast as a watcher, a reminder. On the base of the statue, a single line was engraved. "Courage begins where silence ends." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood still, many with hands over their hearts, others with tears in their eyes. It wasn't a moment for applause. It was a moment for memory. As people came forward one by one, to lay flowers or snap quiet photographs, Clarence stepped back from the stage. Lisa walked beside him. "You're really leaving," she said softly. He nodded. "I came here to make something right. That's done. The rest, that belongs to Ashford now." She studied him for a moment. "Are you going back to your old life?" Clarence gave a small smile. "There's no going back, but there's peace in knowing you've left something better behind." He reached into his coat and handed her a sealed envelope. "Read it when the sun goes down," he said. And with that, Clarence Boyd walked away from the square that once judged him, now bearing his likeness in bronze. That night across the country, Lisa Jennings went live on Channel 9 News. Her tone was quieter than usual. There was no breaking news alert, just the soft rustle of papers, the faint glow of studio lights, and the sealed letter in her hands. She looked directly into the camera. A few weeks ago, the name Clarence Boyd meant nothing to most of us. He was anonymous, forgotten, discarded. But tonight his name means something very different. And before he left Ashford for good, he left me this. She opened the letter carefully, unfolding its neatly handwritten pages. "My name is Clarence Boyd," she read aloud. "I was born in a town smaller than Ashford. I served this country for 30 years, lost friends in deserts I don't care to name, and came home to a country still learning how to treat its own people with dignity." Lisa's voice wavered, but she continued. "I learned something long ago, that the most dangerous force in any society isn't hate. It's silence. Silence keeps good people from doing what's right. It comforts the powerful and suffocates the powerless. It's quiet, but it kills." Lisa paused, then read on. "I never wanted a statue. I didn't even want recognition. I only wanted one thing: for people to stop looking away. If someone like me, a tired old man with a limp and a past, could force a system to look at itself, then imagine what you could do." She looked directly into the lens now. "If you ever stayed quiet when you saw something wrong, if you ever looked down instead of stepping forward, remember me." A beat of silence. "Then stand up." She folded the letter slowly and placed it on the desk. You don't need a badge to do the right thing. You don't need a title to demand better. You just need to refuse to look away. Outside the studio, the night was still. But across the country, people were listening, watching, thinking. Back in Ashford, the town square remained quiet. The statue of Clarence sat in soft golden light from a new lamppost, this time not a tool of shame, but a beacon. Children passed it on their way to school. Veterans nodded when they walked by. Young officers stood a little straighter when they entered the department. Ashford had changed not into a perfect town, but into an honest one, because one man refused to be humiliated, because a waitress spoke up, because a rookie pressed record, because a reporter chased the truth, and because when the weight of injustice finally landed, Clarence Boyd didn't fight back with rage. He fought back with dignity, and justice finally had the last word. And maybe that's the real legacy of Clarence Boyd, not a statue, not a courtroom victory, but a quiet reminder that doing what's right doesn't require power, only the refusal to look away. Ashford didn't change because someone told it to. It changed because one man reminded everyone of who they could be. Now we turn to you. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up, or seen someone do the right thing when no one else dared? Let us know in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else to stand a little taller tomorrow. And if this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because voices like Clarence's deserve to be heard and remembered.